Empires fall for all kinds of reasons: invasions, rebellions, bad weather, or, sheer stupidity. Sometimes the mightiest rulers in history didn't lose to their enemies, but to their own boneheaded decisions. This is times 25 dumbest mistakes that destroyed empires forever. You won't believe #height asterisk. Let's start with the classic, the Roman Empire, the granddaddy of dumb collapses. Rome basically invented the art of self-destruction. Imagine running the biggest empire in the world, stretching from Britain to Egypt, and then deciding, hey, let's split it in half and pretend that won't go wrong. Emperor Diocletian thought dividing Rome into East and West was a genius move for efficiency. Spoiler: it was like cutting your Wi-Fi in half and expecting it to work better. The western half collapsed like a bad Jenga tower, while the eastern half awkwardly watched from across the room. And even that didn't save them for long. Rome didn't fall in one epic battle. It tripped, stumbled, and face-planted over centuries of terrible decisions. Next up, let's talk about the Ming Dynasty. China's Ming emperors had an actual chance at becoming the world's first global superpower. They had the ships, the technology, and an admiral named Zheng He who was out there flexing before Columbus even learned to hold a compass. But the Ming court looked at their giant navy, capable of sailing to Africa, and said, too expensive. Let's burn it all. Yes, they literally torched their fleet, banned shipbuilding, and decided to just vibe behind their Great Wall forever. It's like having the internet in 1450 and then canceling your subscription because who needs all that knowledge anyway? The result? China turned inward, lost its edge, and centuries later was wondering why Europe suddenly showed up with cannons and bad trade deals. And speaking of Europe, let's take a short trip to France, specifically the French Empire under Napoleon. The man conquered most of Europe through sheer audacity and caffeine. But then came Russia. Ah yes, the historical equivalent of I can quit anytime I want. In 1812, Napoleon marched 500,000 men into Russia during winter without proper supplies, without backup, and without, apparently, checking the weather. You'd think someone would have said, hey boss, this might be cold. But nope. The Russians just backed up, burned their own cities, and let winter do the work. Out of 600,000 soldiers, only about 100,000 came back. The rest froze, starved, or got lost somewhere in the snow wondering why their emperor thought frostbite was a strategy. This one dumb decision shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and sent France tumbling down faster than his troops' morale. Now, the British Empire, the empire so big, the sun literally couldn't set on it, because they owned half the globe. But with great power comes great arrogance. The British had the entire Industrial Revolution in their pocket: steamships, guns, trade routes, and still managed to lose 13 colonies because they couldn't grasp one simple idea: people hate taxes, especially when you're charging them for tea. The American Revolution didn't start because of freedom speeches. It started because Britain wanted a 3% markup on breakfast beverages. And when the colonies revolted, the British laughed. They'll never win. Spoiler, they did. Britain's stubbornness, slow communication, and refusal to adapt to guerrilla warfare turned the world's strongest military into the laughingstock of the 18th century. They lost an empire not to a greater force, but to their own ego and some angry dudes in powdered wigs. Finally, for this first round of empire-breaking idiocy, we visit the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, they were called the sick man of Europe. But this wasn't a sudden illness. It was centuries of bad habits. Imagine running a massive empire and deciding to modernize, but only halfway. They tried reforms, created new armies, even set up schools, but then realized modernization meant giving up absolute power, and said, nah, we're good. They refused to industrialize properly, relied on outdated tactics, and kept borrowing from European banks until their economy looked like a student loan spreadsheet. By the time World War I rolled around, the Ottomans joined the losing side again. The final blow? They trusted Germany to help them win, which is kind of like asking a fox to babysit your chickens. 5 empires down, 20 dumb decisions to go. What do these stories have in common? Arrogance, denial, and the unshakable belief that it'll be fine. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Let's pick up where we left off. The world still has plenty of empires who decided that common sense was optional. Case in point, the Aztecs. You'd think a civilization that built floating gardens, massive temples, and a calendar that could predict solar eclipses would have survival instincts. But nope. When a bunch of pale guys with metal hats and weird horses showed up, The Aztecs thought they were literal gods. Emperor Moctezuma welcomed Hernan Cortés like a divine guest instead of, a walking red flag holding a musket. And that hospitality move? It got the entire empire conquered in less than 2 years. Imagine inviting someone to your palace, feeding them, giving them gold, and then watching them burn your city down. The Aztecs didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they trusted the world's worst houseguest. And while we're in the bad trust issues department, let's talk about the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were the eastern leftovers of Rome, and honestly, they were doing okay for a while. That is, until 1204. The Fourth Crusade rolled in, supposedly to reclaim Jerusalem. But these holy warriors took one look at Constantinople and said, "That looks easier." They sacked their time-zone Christian allies **. Imagine hiring a moving company, and instead of helping, they steal your furniture, burn your house, and say it's for religious reasons. The Byzantines never fully recovered. By the time the Ottomans showed up with cannons 2 centuries later, the empire was basically a ghost of itself. Still impressive on paper, but in reality, running on vibes and nostalgia. Now, let's turn the spotlight to one of history's biggest overreactions: the Spanish Empire. Once upon a time, Spain was drowning in gold from the New World. And what do you do when you have more money than sense? You spend it all. Spain imported so much silver from the Americas that it triggered global inflation. The literal value of money dropped because they had too much of it. Their economy went full broke billionaire. And instead of fixing it, Spanish kings kept borrowing, taxing, and declaring bankruptcy like it was a seasonal tradition. The empire that once ruled the oceans ended up bankrupt 5 times in less than 100 years. 5. Imagine if Jeff Bezos went bankrupt 5 times and still said, "Nah, I got this." Spain's arrogance turned their golden age into a financial disaster no amount of treasure could fix. Jumping east, the Mughal Empire of India, another powerful dynasty that thought it was invincible. At its peak, the Mughal court was dripping in wealth. Literally. The peacock throne alone cost more than some small kingdoms. But by the 18th century, the Mughals had stopped governing and started, just chilling. Endless palace parties, power struggles, and religious intolerance cracked the foundation. The emperors ignored the growing power of the British East India Company, a glorified trading firm that slowly ate their territory piece by piece. When they finally realized the British weren't there to do business but to times own everything *, it was too late. The once glorious empire that built the Taj Mahal was reduced to a colonial footnote. Talk about going from architectural genius to corporate victim. Next up, we have the Russian Empire because, of course, they're here. If there's one thing Russia's old rulers were good at, it was making every possible mistake twice. Take Tsar Nicholas II. The guy had one job: don't ruin the empire. But he managed to bungle not one but 2 wars. First, he decided to pick a fight with Japan in 1904 because apparently he thought Asian countries didn't know how to fight back. The Japanese Navy promptly humiliated Russia so badly that it shocked the entire world. Then came World War I, where Nicholas personally took command of his army despite knowing nothing about military strategy and left the government in the hands of Rasputin, a self-proclaimed holy man who made TikTok influencers look humble. By 1917, the Russian people were done. Revolution, abdication, execution, boom. Centuries of Romanov rule ended because the Tsar thought charisma was a strategy. We're only 10 mistakes in, and we've already got empires trusting conquerors, crusaders robbing allies, kings bankrupting their kingdoms, emperors ghosting reality, and Tsars trusting weird monks. If history had a blooper reel, this would be the highlight montage. And the best part? It's only going to get dumber from here. At this point, history is practically screaming, "Please, learn from your mistakes." But no empires seem to treat common sense like a banned substance. Take the Holy Roman Empire. You'd think an empire that lasted 1,000 years had it figured out, right? Wrong. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor really much of an empire. It was basically a chaotic family group chat with crowns. For centuries, dozens of tiny German states argued over who was in charge, while the emperors tried to pretend they still mattered. When the Protestant Reformation hit, instead of fixing the problem, they turned it into a 30-year bloodbath. The 30 Years' War destroyed half of Central Europe. Millions dead, cities in ruins, all because the empire couldn't agree on which version of Christianity was correct. By the end, the empire was so divided it might as well have been a patchwork quilt with delusions of grandeur. Unity? Optional. Dysfunction? Mandatory. Now let's swing over to the Inca Empire, one of the most organized civilizations on the planet. They built highways across mountains, stored food for years, and had a government that actually worked. So how did it all collapse? One word: timing. In the 1,520 seconds, a civil war broke out between two brothers fighting for the throne. By the time Atahualpa finally won, his army was exhausted. And then, surprise! Francisco Pizarro showed up with fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers and a lot of guns. The Incas could have easily crushed them with numbers, but Atahualpa thought he was untouchable. So he let Pizarro into his camp, unarmed. Moments later, cannons fired, chaos erupted, and the Inca emperor was captured. The empire that ruled millions fell to a handful of conquistadors because one ruler thought diplomacy was more fashionable than caution. It's the historical equivalent of downloading malware because the pop-up said, "Trust me, I'm safe." And speaking of trusting the wrong people, let's talk about the Crusader states, the medieval startup that thought invading the Middle East would be a long-term business model. These European knights built mini-kingdoms on land that wasn't theirs, surrounded by people who absolutely did not want them there. They spent decades fighting locals, arguing with each other, and ignoring logistics. When Saladin eventually showed up, the guy who actually knew how to run an army, they were caught completely off guard. Jerusalem fell in 1187, and the Crusader dream of ruling the Holy Land went times poof. Asterisk. Their mistake? Thinking you can colonize a continent with no plan for food, allies, or geography. It's like moving into a neighborhood and assuming everyone will be chill with you just because you brought a cross and a bad attitude. But for pure, jaw-dropping idiocy, few can beat the Qing dynasty's refusal to modernize. By the 19th century, China had been humiliated by the Opium Wars, carved up by foreign powers, and still somehow thought tradition would fix everything. When the British offered industrial tech and trade reforms, the Qing elite basically said, "Nah. We're good with our silk and tea." They clung to Confucian bureaucracy like it was a life raft even as that raft was on fire. Their arrogance led to one of the biggest cell phones in history, the Taiping Rebellion. A failed civil servant claimed he was Jesus' younger brother, and tens of millions joined his rebellion. The result? 20 to 30 million people dead, all because the empire was too proud to adapt. By the time they tried modernizing, Japan, their once lesser neighbor, was out here winning wars and building railroads. The Qing dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own stubbornness and outdated haircuts. And that brings us to perhaps the most tragic of all the Confederate States of America. They decided, in 1861, that it was a great idea to secede from the U.S. because they didn't want to give up slavery. They underestimated the industrial power, manpower, and sheer determination of the North. Their economy was built on cotton and denial. They thought King Cotton would get Britain and France to help them. But those countries had already moved on, turns out. Morals were trending that century. The Confederacy's leadership was divided, their infrastructure weak, and their diplomacy non-existent. The result was a devastating civil war that not only destroyed the South but rewrote American history. It's the ultimate "we played ourselves" moment. We've reached the middle of our list, and the pattern is getting painfully clear. Empires don't die because they're weak. They die because they double down on stupid decisions, believing pride is strategy, faith is policy, and luck is leadership. And if you think that's as dumb as it gets, just wait till you see what comes next. You'd think after thousands of years of watching empires self-destruct, someone would have written a manual called Asterisk, How Not to Lose. Everything in 10 simple steps. Asterisk. But no, history kept hitting replay. Take the Mongol Empire. They had it all: speed, strategy, and the terrifying ability to conquer half the known world while riding horses that looked like angry plush toys. But after Genghis Khan died, his descendants decided to turn that global domination into a family drama. The empire split into 4 khanates, each run by a different branch of the family, and shocker, they didn't get along. Cousins went to war, trade routes fell apart, and the once unified Mongol war machine turned into a messy medieval soap opera. It's like if Amazon, Apple, Google, and Microsoft were all run by siblings who hated each other. The Mongols weren't defeated by enemies. They were undone by ego and inheritance disputes. And speaking of inheritance meltdowns, let's visit the Spanish Netherlands, or, as historians like to call it, The Habsburg family's long breakup. The Spanish Habsburgs ruled so many regions through intermarriage that their family tree looked more like a pretzel. By the 17th century, their bloodline was so inbred that King Charles II of Spain couldn't chew properly, speak clearly, or, crucially, have an heir. When he died in 1700, it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, basically a European brawl over who got Spain's leftovers. Years of war, chaos, and destruction, all because one royal family couldn't resist marrying its cousins for 200 years straight. Forget Game of Thrones, this was game of genetics. Let's jump to Africa specifically. The Kingdom of Congo. Once a thriving and sophisticated state, the Congo rulers made the catastrophic mistake of trusting European traders too much. When the Portuguese arrived, they promised friendship, trade, and religion. But trade quickly turned into take, and friendship turned into slavery. The Congo elites allowed the slave trade to expand. Thinking it would bring wealth instead, it tore their society apart. Civil wars erupted, population collapsed, and the once prosperous kingdom became a puppet for foreign powers. It's one of those brutal ironies of history. They thought they were gaining allies, but they were actually signing their empire's death warrant. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, the Persian Empire under the Qajars was having its own hold my tea moment. By the 19th century, Persia was strategically located between two hungry giants, Russia and Britain. So what did the Qajar rulers do? They sold off their resources, signed one-sided treaties, and turned corruption into a national hobby. They handed out oil concessions to foreign companies like free samples at Costco. By the time Persia realized how much it had lost, they weren't running an empire anymore. They were running a giveaway event. The Qajar mistake wasn't one dramatic fall. It was a slow bleed caused by greed, short-term thinking, and diplomatic incompetence. And let's not forget the Mayan civilization, the original masters of astronomy, architecture, and self-sabotage. Their cities were engineering marvels. Their calendars still confuse people today, and yet, they disappeared. Why? Well, partly because they deforested their own land to build more temples. They literally chopped down their environment faster than they could adapt. Combine that with droughts, wars, and political infighting, and the Maya basically climate changed themselves out of existence. It's like watching someone burn down their house because they wanted better lighting. Scientists still debate the exact cause, but one thing's clear. The empire didn't fall to outsiders. It imploded from within, one tree at a time. Now let's fast forward to something a little closer to home, the Soviet Union. If there were an award for empire that imploded the most dramatically on live TV, the USSR would win. On paper, they had everything: nukes, space tech, global influence. But their system was built on fear, inefficiency, and denial. The Soviets poured money into the arms race while ignoring the fact that people couldn't even buy decent bread. By the 1980 seconds, corruption was rampant, censorship was cracking, and the economy was so broken it made a 1990 seconds computer look stable. When Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform things with Times Glasnost, Times and Times Perestroika asterisk, it was like trying to fix a sinking ship by installing bigger windows. The reforms backfired, republics started declaring independence, and within a few years, poof, the Soviet Union was gone. Not conquered, not invaded, just unplugged. By now, it's hard not to notice the pattern. The bigger the empire, the dumber its downfall. Pride, greed, ignorance. Take your pick. From cuisine-married kings to ice-cold winters, the universe seems to have a rule. The moment you think your empire will last forever, history starts sharpening the knives. And now, for the grand finale, the last 5 dumb mistakes that turned mighty empires into historical cautionary tales. Let's start with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the overcomplicated roommate situation of Europe. 2 kingdoms, 1 crown, 0 common sense. The empire was a patchwork of nationalities all pretending to get along. Czechs, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, you name it. The rulers, desperate to keep everyone happy, managed to please no one. By the early 1900s, it was basically a pressure cooker with a crown. Then came the moment of genius. Sending Archduke Franz Ferdinand on a goodwill tour to Bosnia, a region full of angry nationalists who really didn't want to see him. He was assassinated in Sarajevo, and Austria-Hungary's reaction? Declare war on Serbia. What followed was World War I, an event that didn't just destroy their empire, but also dragged half the planet into chaos. So yeah, one assassination, one overreaction, and goodbye to centuries of royal prestige. Next, let's look at the Egyptian Empire, specifically the New Kingdom under pharaohs, who thought building giant temples was a better investment than, say, defending their borders. By the time the late dynasties rolled around, corruption had spread like sand in a desert storm. The priests of Amun had more money and power than the pharaoh himself, and everyone was too busy arguing about tomb decorations to notice invaders knocking on the door. When the Sea Peoples arrived, mysterious warriors who basically speedran coastal destruction, Egypt's armies crumbled. They survived, technically, but their empire never recovered. It's like if the world's richest CEO forgot to pay the security guards because he was too busy decorating his yacht. Now, we can't skip over the Dutch Empire, the economic powerhouse that once ruled the seas with trade, spice, and the occasional pirate flag. The Dutch were brilliant merchants but catastrophically bad at humility. When they dominated the spice trade in the 17th century, they didn't just make profits, they made enemies. Britain, France, and even tiny Portugal all ganged up eventually. But their biggest mistake was betting everything on colonies they couldn't defend and a financial system that relied on eternal peace in Europe. Spoiler: Europe doesn't times do times peace. Endless wars, economic crashes, and overextension turned the once mighty Dutch East India Company into a bankrupt shell. The company that invented capitalism collapsed under the same greed it taught everyone else. Then there's the Kingdom of France again, but this time not under Napoleon. This time, we're talking about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the power couple who thought being out of touch was a personality trait. France was drowning in debt, peasants were starving, and the court's response was, essentially, let them eat cake. Whether or not she actually said it doesn't matter, the vibe was accurate. They refused to reform, ignored economic collapse, and treated revolution warnings like spam emails. The French Revolution didn't just topple the monarchy, it set the blueprint for every how to lose your head and your throne story after that. The moral? Don't host parties when your citizens can't afford bread. And finally, for #5, the one you won't believe, the Third Reich. Yes, the Nazis. Because no list of world-ending stupidity is complete without Adolf Hitler's absolute masterclass in delusion. After blitzing through Europe with terrifying speed, Hitler decided, like Napoleon before him, that invading Russia in winter was a great idea. What is it with egomaniacs and Russian winters? Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history, and it failed spectacularly. Millions of soldiers froze, starved, or got stuck in supply lines that stretched thousands of miles. Add in Hitler's obsession with micromanaging every battle from a bunker and refusing to retreat even when surrounded, and boom, the 1,000-year Reich didn't even make it to 15. His pride didn't just destroy an empire. It burned an entire continent to the ground. So, what have we learned from 25 of history's dumbest empire-ending mistakes? That power doesn't protect you from stupidity. In fact, it seems to attract it. From Rome's arrogance to Spain's inflation, from the Ming's burned ships to Napoleon's frozen toes, the message is loud and clear. Arrogance kills, denial buries, and history laughs. Every fallen empire thought it was invincible. Everyone believed it was too advanced, too righteous, or too chosen to fail. And every single one was wrong. Maybe that's why we love looking back at their failures, because it's oddly comforting. The next time you make a dumb decision, just remember, at least you didn't bankrupt a kingdom, start a world war, or march 500,000 soldiers into a snowstorm without coats. History is a never-ending comedy of confidence and collapse, written by people who thought they'd never make the blooper reel. So which of these would you keep just because it makes history more fun? Tell us in the comments, and hit like and subscribe for more unapologetically weird history from Factopia 25.